Hey everyone, before we jump into today's deep dive, just a quick reminder that you can subscribe to the show on YouTube, Spotify, and Amazon. Okay, so let's get into it. Today, we're tackling a question that I think has been on a lot of people's minds lately. Are we, and I kind of hesitate to even say it, on the brink of World War III?
Yeah, it's a heavy question for sure.
It is. And, we've gotten a ton of articles and reports from you guys that paint a pretty intense picture of what's happening globally, especially in Europe.
Right.
We've got Finland and Sweden sending out wartime prep guides to their citizens, Poland's tripling their military presence, and the U.S. just gave the green light for Ukraine to use long-range missiles that can hit targets inside Russia.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to unpack.
It is. And to make things even more interesting, we have Donald Trump back in the White House, and he's promising to end the war in Ukraine quickly. So where do we even begin with all of this?
Well, I think it's helpful to look at each of these developments individually because they're all significant in their own right. But then, yeah, when you put them all together, it really does raise some serious questions about where things are headed.
Okay, so let's break it down piece by piece. First up, Trump's victory and this big promise of peace. He's been saying that he could have ended the war in Ukraine in just 24 hours if he'd been president during the invasion. What do you make of that claim?
Well, the biggest red flag for me is that there are almost no specifics about how he would actually achieve that.
Right. It's all pretty vague.
Exactly. His vice president, J.D. Vance, has mentioned setting up a demilitarized zone in Ukraine and also putting pressure on Ukraine to abandon its efforts to join NATO and the European Union.
Which, let's be honest, would be seen as a major win for Russia.
Absolutely. But how any of that would actually play out on the ground and whether it would lead to a lasting peace, well, that's anyone's guess at this point.
It does seem like, and I'm trying to be charitable here, a risky strategy at best.
At best.
Okay, so let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is the massive amount of financial and military aid the U.S. has given to Ukraine. We're talking upwards of $61 billion, which is a staggering amount of money.
It is.
How do you see that playing out under a Trump administration?
Well, he's been very critical of that spending, and there's definitely concern that he could reduce or even cut off that aid altogether.
Which, I don't even have to say it, would have a huge impact on Ukraine's ability to defend itself.
A huge impact, yes.
So we've got this interesting dynamic here. On one hand, we have Trump, who seems to be leaning toward a less interventionist approach.
Right, more diplomacy, less military action.
Exactly. A complete 180 from Biden's strategy, I would say. But then on the other hand, you have Zelensky, who has made it very clear that Ukraine will not give up any territory. And he refuses to negotiate with Russia while they still occupy parts of Ukraine. How do you see this all playing out?
Well, you've got two very strong personalities with very different visions, so there's definitely potential for clashing there. Zelensky's position is totally understandable, given everything that Ukraine has been through, but it could create major friction with a Trump administration that wants a quick resolution, one way or another.
And this shift in U.S. policy, well, let's just say it's making a lot of people nervous, not just in Ukraine, but among European allies too. They've been relying on the U.S. for leadership in this crisis.
Yeah, it's created a lot of anxiety, that's for sure.
Okay, let's move on to Finland and Sweden, which for decades have maintained a neutral stance. But Russia's invasion of Ukraine seems to have pushed them right into NATO's arms. And now they're sending out these wartime preparedness guides to their citizens. What's going on there? What's driving this sudden sense of urgency?
Well, being so close to Russia has always made them vulnerable, but seeing what happened in Ukraine has definitely amplified those concerns.
Yeah.
They're basically getting ready for the possibility that the conflict could spill over.
And they're not just talking about it. They're taking some pretty concrete steps.
They are.
Sweden, for example, is handing out 5 million copies of this brochure. It's called Om krisen eller kriget kommer, which, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, means in case of crisis or war. And Finland's gone a little more high-tech. They've launched an interactive website with similar advice.
Right, kind of a modern take on those old preparedness pamphlets.
Yeah, exactly. It's a little surreal to see this happening in countries that haven't had to think about war for generations.
It is, and the advice they're giving is pretty eye-opening, too.
It is.
Yeah.
They're telling people to stockpile food and water, giving them information about bomb shelters, and even addressing things like cyber attacks.
Right, because that's a whole new dimension to modern warfare.
It is, and it really drives home the point that the threat is very real. Michael Friesel, who's the director of the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency, said that everyone needs to strengthen their resilience, which I think is a great way to put it.
It is. It's a delicate balance for these governments. They want to prepare people without causing mass panic.
It's a tough line to walk for sure. So we've got Trump promising a speedy end to the war, though it's not exactly clear how, and Finland and Sweden are prepping their citizens for the worst. But then you have Poland, and Poland seems to be, well, let's just say they're taking a much more aggressive approach.
Yeah, they're not just preparing, they're actively building up their military. Like, they're really afraid of Russia, and they're ready to defend themselves at all costs. They're definitely not messing around. They've tripled the number of troops at the borders with Kaliningrad and Belarus.
Wow, so from like 6,000 to 17,000 soldiers.
Yeah, that's a huge increase. And get this, these include rapid response units that can be deployed within 48 hours.
So they're basically ready to go at a moment's notice.
It really shows you how serious they are.
And this isn't just about, showing off, right? They're putting their money where their mouth is, so to speak.
Big time. Their defense budget is now 4% of their GDP, which is actually more than what NATO recommends.
And didn't you say they've drastically increased their military spending?
Yeah, between 2022 and 2023, it went from 12 to 20 billion euros.
That's a serious commitment. So are they actually buying new equipment?
Oh, yeah, they're buying weapons and stuff from the U.S. and South Korea. And it's not just the government either.
What do you mean?
We're seeing a huge surge in civilian involvement in paramilitary groups. Like, even teenagers as young as 13 are joining up.
Wow.
It's like the whole country is getting ready to fight. They're calling it a whole-of-society approach to defense.
That's incredible. It really shows you how concerned they are.
Yeah, and they've got this project, it's called Eastern Shield, where they're fortifying 400 kilometers of their border with Russia and Belarus.
The wall, basically.
Pretty much, yeah. And it's going to cost them over 2 billion euros. They're hoping to have it finished by 2028. And on top of that, they recently sent up fighter jets to monitor their airspace after a big Russian attack in Ukraine.
So they're not taking any chances?
Nope. They see this as a real and present danger.
So you've got Poland making these major military moves, and then you've got the U.S., which just authorized Ukraine to use long-range missiles against targets inside Russia. I mean, that's a pretty big deal.
It's huge. This is the first time the U.S. has given Ukraine permission to strike inside Russia.
And I imagine Russia's not too happy about it.
Not at all. It's definitely escalating tensions, and I think it's a direct response to what's happening in Ukraine with those North Korean troops now fighting alongside Russian forces. Kyiv has been asking for these missiles for a while.
Right. So what can you tell us about these missiles? How much of a game changer are we talking about here?
Well, they have a range of about 300 kilometers, so they can definitely change things up on the battlefield. But some experts think that their impact might be limited.
Interesting.
Yeah, and even French President Macron, who's usually pretty cautious, has come out in support of the decision. He called it a perfectly good response to Russia's escalation, especially with North Korea getting involved now.
So it sounds like the U.S. is trying to tread carefully. They're giving Ukraine more firepower, but they also don't want to trigger a direct confrontation with Russia.
Exactly. They're walking a tightrope. But the thing is, there are serious concerns about what could happen next. This is likely to make things even worse between the U.S. and Russia, especially with Putin making those recent statements about expanding when Russia might use nuclear weapons.
Yeah, that was pretty chilling.
It was. And there are some American politicians, mostly Republicans, who are worried about this decision. They're concerned that it could destabilize the region.
Okay, so we've got Trump, Finland, Sweden, Poland, Ukraine, and Russia, all sort of tangled up in this. It's a lot to digest, and to be honest, it doesn't paint the most optimistic picture.
No, it doesn't. And there's another big piece we haven't really touched on yet.
What's that?
What Russia might do next, how they might retaliate. Yeah, retaliation, that's the big unknown here.
So let's talk about that. What are the potential ways that Russia might respond to all of this?
Well, I mean, the scariest possibility is that Putin might actually follow through on those threats to use nuclear weapons. But there are other, maybe less dramatic, but still very serious ways they could retaliate too.
Okay, like what?
Cyber attacks.
Right. That seems like a pretty safe bet.
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen them target infrastructure in other countries, like you said, so it wouldn't be surprising if they went after the U.S. next.
Makes sense. What else?
Well, they could escalate the conflict in Ukraine itself. I mean, they could launch even bigger attacks, or maybe even, and I hesitate to even say it, but they could try to expand into neighboring countries.
Oh, wow. Okay, so that's pretty terrifying. Anything else?
Well, there's always the option of supporting anti-US activities around the world, kind of stirring up trouble in different hotspots. They've definitely done that before.
So it seems like there are a lot of different ways this could play out, and none of them are particularly good.
No, they're not. And that's what makes the situation so unpredictable and, frankly, so dangerous. I mean, any one of these actions could trigger a chain reaction that spirals out of control. One wrong move and things could escalate very quickly.
It does feel like we're teetering on the edge of something really bad here.
I think that's a fair assessment.
So the big question, the question that I know everyone listening is wondering, is are we on the brink of World War III? Is it inevitable at this point?
Honestly, I don't think anyone can answer that for sure.
Right.
But the developments that we've talked about, they do paint a pretty sobering picture. I mean, it's clear that countries are preparing for the possibility of a larger conflict, and the stakes are incredibly high. This isn't just some regional squabble. This is a global power struggle with potentially catastrophic consequences.
It's a lot to process. As we kind of wrap things up here, I'm curious, what stands out to you the most from all this information? Like, what are you left wondering about?
Well, what strikes me is how quickly things have changed. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that we were talking about, a relatively stable world, and now all of a sudden we're facing this level of tension and uncertainty. It's like the rug's been pulled out from under us.
What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that peace is fragile, that we can't take it for granted.
It's a good reminder, for sure. And it also underscores the fact that this isn't just some abstract geopolitical drama playing out in the background. This is real, it's happening right now, and it affects every single one of us.
Absolutely. I mean, the decisions that leaders make in Washington and Moscow and Kyiv, they're going to have a huge impact on people all over the world.
This deep dive has really given us a lot to think about. I mean, we've covered Trump's return to the White House, the dramatic changes in Finland and Sweden, the military buildup in Poland, the U.S. giving Ukraine those long-range missiles, and now the potential for Russia to retaliate. It's all connected, and it's all, well, let's just say it's pretty scary stuff. So what are the key takeaways here? What should people be thinking about?
Well, first and foremost, stay informed. I know it sounds obvious, but this situation is constantly changing, and it's important to keep up with the latest developments. Don't just rely on headlines. Try to go a little deeper, read different perspectives, and form your own opinions.
That's great advice.
And then talk about it. Don't be afraid to have these difficult conversations with your friends and family. I mean, this is stuff that affects all of us. We need to be talking about it, debating it, figuring out what it all means.
Right, because this isn't just about politics or military strategy. It's about our future.
Exactly. And lastly, hold our leaders accountable. Let them know that we're paying attention, that we care about these issues, and that we expect them to do everything in their power to prevent a wider conflict.
I love that. Well said. Well, I think that's a good place to end our deep dive today. But of course, this is just the beginning of the conversation. This situation is evolving all the time, so it's important to stay informed and stay engaged. And if you're feeling overwhelmed by all this, that's understandable. But don't give up hope. We can make a difference. It starts with each one of us being informed, engaged, and active citizens. So thank you so much for joining us today. Don't forget to like this episode and subscribe to The Deep Dive for more discussions on the most pressing issues of our time. We'll continue to explore these topics in future episodes, so stay tuned. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged.